If you're a parent or caregiver and someone has advised you that your child needs a feeding tube, you're probably feeling very overwhelmed. I'm Laura McGrath of Our Special Lives, and today we're going to talk about our decision to place a feeding tube in our son when he was 3 months old and how we've absolutely grown to love our feeding tube. I want to go through the top myths that keep people afraid of getting a feeding tube. And I'm hoping that hearing from a parent who's been through this situation before will help you in your own decision. Before we get started, we're going to talk about some of the reasons why a child might get a feeding tube. The first one is that they may be born premature, they may have an underlying heart condition, or they may have a neurological injury or condition, which makes it really difficult for them to handle food or liquids in their mouth. And unless they get a feeding tube, they really are not going to be able to get adequate food or hydration. The second reason is that some children, because they have a sensory disorder or something else going on, are labeled failure to thrive. And that means that they are able to handle food and liquid in their mouth, but they're just not able to take in enough to maintain an adequate weight. And the third reason is that they may have a genetic malformation, which makes it very difficult for them to eat by mouth. All three of these situations may lead to a healthcare practitioner suggesting that your child get a feeding tube. If your child is in need of getting a feeding tube, you may be feeling a wide range of emotions: fear, overwhelm, worry, disappointment. All of these are perfectly normal emotions. And adding to that is that you were likely under a great deal of stress in whatever circumstances gave rise to the need for a feeding tube to start with. So let me tell you a little bit about our decision to get a feeding tube for our son when he was 3 months old. Our story is that our son was born in September of 2009, and during birth there was a complication. His umbilical cord was trapped over his right shoulder for a period of time, and he didn't get enough oxygen during the birth process. That lack of oxygen led to injury to all of his organs, but the most serious of those was an injury to the area of his brain that controls motor function, which includes swallowing. After he was born, he was resuscitated, and he spent 35 days in the NICU recovering from these injuries. He recovered from all but that brain injury. And every day that we were in the hospital, we worked with feeding therapists and speech therapists to try to get him to eat by mouth. But no matter what we did and how often we worked on it, we just could not get him to take formula by mouth. And so we ended up leaving the hospital with something called an NG tube, or nasogastric tube. And it's a tube that's taped to your face and goes up your nose, down the back of your throat, into your stomach. And that's his primary source. That was his only source of food and hydration. In this picture, you can see what a nasogastric tube looks like. As we were getting ready to leave the NICU, the doctors advised that they wanted to place a feeding tube. But unfortunately, we were resistant to that idea for several reasons. Why did we do that? It turns out that we were telling ourselves a lot of stories. I call them myths. And they didn't end up being true. And I wish my current self from today could go back to myself 10 years ago with what I know now about feeding tubes. It would have made the decision so much easier. So what were some of these thoughts that we had? Well, the first thought is that we were giving up on our son. We thought that if we had just done more therapy or if we had done something different, he would be eating by mouth. It was like the idea of a feeding tube was so overwhelming we couldn't get our heads around it. It wasn't like anyone else we knew had a feeding tube, and we imagined the worst. We imagined that it would impact our quality of life and our son's quality of life. It didn't feel like something that we could handle. It was like the most basic act of parenting, feeding our child, was being taken away from us. And we felt like there's just something so wrong and so abnormal about eating through a feeding tube. The sad part is that while we spent months resisting the feeding tube, feeding through that NG tube through his mouth was so incredibly stressful. NG tubes can get lodged in the lung if you're not careful. They frequently come out and need to be replaced. The skin on our son's face was raw from taking the tube out and taping it from one side of his face to the other. I know families who are very stressed for months at mealtimes because their children won't eat or can't eat enough and are losing huge amounts of weight. It's all very stressful when your child can't eat by mouth. So how do parents make this difficult decision? And how did I come to absolutely love our feeding tube? Well, I'm going to go through the myths one by one and see if dispelling some of these myths about feeding tubes can help you in your decision. Okay, so let's go through the myths one by one. Myth number one, we were giving up on our child. Now, this just is not true. Many children who get feeding tubes go on to eat successfully by mouth. And even if they don't fully eat by mouth, or if they don't eat by mouth at all, like our son, a hydrated and well-nourished child has the most optimal chance of success with anything. Okay, now we're on myth number two, which is if I had just done more therapy or done something differently, my child would be eating by mouth by now. Now, we are huge fans of feeding therapists and speech therapists, and we think they do amazing work. And our son has seen some great therapists over the years. But it is just not realistic if your child is facing serious challenges to think that you can make them eat in a certain time period. A feeding tube can really be a bridge to bridge that gap between them working on a skill that they need to master and getting adequate food and hydration in the meantime. Okay, now we're on myth number three, which is our quality of life and our child's quality of life is going to be very negatively impacted by this decision. Again, not true. I have a great quality of life. My husband has a great quality of life. We have an amazing family. We go on trips. We have fun. The feeding tube is really not an issue. Yes, it's a little bit of an adjustment in the beginning, but overall we have a wonderful quality of life and our son has an awesome quality of life. We eat together, we have family meals. He can either eat separately or he can eat with us. He can either eat something that's on his diet or he can eat part of the food that we're eating. I have another video on blenderized diets and how to blend food that your family eats as well. But quality of life, not an issue. Okay, now we're on myth number four, which is having a feeding tube is so abnormal. There's just something wrong with needing a feeding tube. I want you to listen very carefully here. We all eat pureed food through a tube. In our case, we're chewing the food and it's going down our esophagus. In my son's case, we put the food in a blender and then we put it through a tube in his stomach. There's really not a whole lot of difference. Okay, so here's some additional information that might be useful as you're making this decision. I'm going to show you what a feeding tube looks like. Can you see it? This is my son's feeding tube. It's very teeny. It's like the size of an earring. It's actually smaller than my earring. So it's not scary. It's very tiny. It sits on the surface of my son's stomach like this. This is the top part, and then this is the part that goes into his stomach. So here's a picture of him with the feeding tube in. No one sees it except for the people who feed him. These feeding tubes work like an earring. The top part sits outside of your stomach. This goes through the layers of your stomach, the skin, the fat, the muscle, and then the lining of your stomach. And this bottom part works like almost like a little sprinkler head. So the food comes in here and then it exits here into the stomach. So bottom line, this really scary big feeding tube is just this little thing, just about the size of a golf tee. There are some things you need to do when you get a feeding tube. There's some things you need to learn. There's some equipment. There's an adjustment period. I'm going to go do another video that's going to talk about the first 2 weeks after this feeding tube surgery and kind of what to expect based on our experience. Of course, your health care practitioner can walk you through anything in that regard, but I'm just going to give you some parent-to-parent tips on what to expect. Learning how to use a feeding tube is like anything else in life. It's a little challenging at first, but I'm sure you've done other challenging things and you've come out just fine. This is no different than that. So I hope this video has been helpful for you in giving you some things to think about as you're deciding whether or not to get a feeding tube for your child. I know it's a big decision. I hope some of the things we've talked about today were helpful to you. If you liked this video, I'd appreciate you hitting like. If you want to hear more videos like this one about other feeding tube issues or other issues related to children with special needs, please hit subscribe or visit us on our website, ourspeciallives.com. Feel free to ask a question. If there's a topic that you'd like covered, I'd love to know about it. Thanks again for listening.